You're listening to BioTalk with Rich Bendis, the only podcast focused on the biohealth capital region. Each episode, we'll talk to leaders in the industry to break down the biggest topics happening today in biohealth.
Hi, this is Rich Bendis with Biohealth Innovation and your host for BioTalk. And we know in this challenging time that we're going through right now, a lot of the companies in the biohealth and life science industry are trying to find creative ways to obtain financing or investment in their companies. And we thought that we would bring a special guest to our listeners with one of the largest financing firms in the world to you today. And we have Sara Dauber, who is the vice president with JPMorgan, and she focuses on early stage life sciences and healthcare startup banking. And Sara and I go back a few years when she used to be at NIH, and we welcome her to BioTalk today.
Thank you. Thank you, Rich. I'm glad to be here with you.
Yeah, it's great to catch up again in your new life. You've come over to another side of this world. Both with National Institute of Health, you used to do some financing on the grant side. Now you're looking at things a little differently from the banking side. Before we start with talking about your new role, why don't you introduce yourself to the listeners, please, Sara, and talk a little bit about your evolution to get to where you are today.
Thank you. Yes, happy to meet your listeners and really happy to have the time to talk to you. Thank you. It's nice to introduce myself in this way to the BHI community. I've been here interacting with BHI for many years, but haven't had this formal kind of opportunity. My career has, as a through line, had interaction with the business of science and working with life science companies throughout my career. I started out as a student of biology and realized pretty quickly with some summer college jobs that I did not want to work in a lab for my career, that I didn't want to pursue a PhD, which was what I thought I would do when I was 17. And instead found myself working in life science operating companies after business school. So got an MBA at Harvard Business School and then used that as an opportunity to pivot into life science companies. I spent some time in big public companies, but discovered in my Boston years that I really liked working in very early stage life science startups, that it was really fun to be in a new growing organization where there was very little structure and where the job included doing a lot of different things. I held a variety of different roles. Usually the business tasks were extremely varied of what I was asked to do on a given day, from writing website content one day, maybe to setting up benefits for the small group of employees another day, to leading program teams that were setting timelines and moving assets through development. There were also times that I owned the forecasting function, for example, at a startup, and a cap table. I served on one board as the secretary of the board. That was fun. Gave me a lot of insight at a young age into the board of directors experience. And there were times I negotiated license agreements. There was a venture debt deal I did. I could go on and on. I was a jack of all trades, doing a lot of different things. I moved to the DC area for my husband's job about 8 years ago, and so found myself here. As you mentioned, I was at NIH briefly. In my role at NIH, I was a advisor who worked on one of the small business teams. So I was interacting a lot with management teams who received SBIR grants. But that ended with the DOGE cuts in last year. It was not a transition I planned, but as we know, a lot of things changed in the region, and there was a lot of people who were looking for new things, and that included me. So I made this very big midlife career pivot and found myself in a new space. And so here in my role at JPMorgan, I am a banker working in the commercial bank with early stage life science and healthcare companies, and we provide banking tools and services to that stage of company.
Thank you for that background. And I think for the listeners, and a lot of those early stage entrepreneurs, researchers, and scientists, you have an ideal background because you've actually lived what they're going through. And sometimes that's how do we make payroll on Friday? That's one of the great dreams and challenges that these entrepreneurs have all the time. So let's talk a little bit about the focus of your role in the commercial bank of JPMorgan and the types of life science and healthcare companies you work with, and generally what stage are they within the company life cycle?
Yeah. So I work with companies that are pre-Series A. That's the focus of this startup banking group here at JPMorgan. And I work exclusively with companies that are life science and healthcare ventures. So usually these companies come to bank with me around the time of their first institutional raise. So maybe they've been bootstrapping for a short time. Maybe they brought in some non-dilutive capital from an SBIR grant or an STTR grant at some point in the past. But they're interested in working with me and banking with JPMorgan Startup Banking around that time of that first dilutive raise. And the companies may be developing therapeutics. They might be working on medical devices. I also bank software companies who are developing software for a clinical or hospital setting, or maybe an app for use in clinical trials. And also, let's say, a biomanufacturer who is supporting the shift we're seeing towards organoids. That would also be a client that I would work with.
So that's a good broad base of life science companies. And then just to differentiate for the listeners, are you primarily on the debt side rather than the equity side, Sarah, or do you also participate in the equity side?
So the part of the commercial bank I work in is the part that provides the tools and products and services that small businesses need to receive funds and pay funds. So we are providing those building blocks of functionality, including checking account, savings account, CDs, credit cards, ways that companies can receive cash in from their investors or other sources and pay cash out to their varied stakeholders, and be able to do that with a really reputable and highly regarded brand name bank at their side, even as they are a very early stage company trying to build their own brand in the market.
Gotcha. So you're working with the chief financial officers or controllers or people who are actually managing the finances of the company.
Yeah, at the stage that I work with companies, usually the teams are very small. So it's typically the CEO, maybe a CFO who's involved. But usually the companies, when I work with them, haven't really been able to build out yet because they are still, let's say, just raising their first institutional investment. The team is lean and everyone is doing a lot of things. Remember, harken back to what I enjoyed so much when I was in a startup. That means that you have the same people making all the decisions and operating and executing. So I tend to work with those senior people on the management team.
Excellent. JPMorgan really covers the whole waterfront, basically from very early stage to very mature. How does JPMorgan help grow with the company through this whole full life cycle as these early stage startups start to mature, maybe getting to the Series A or an IPO or preparing for some type of a strategic partnership relationship?
Yeah, so we have a number of ways that we help companies within the part of the bank I'm in. So I'll tell you about that a little bit. And then I'll also tell you about how companies grow with the bank, because you really never outgrow JPMorgan Chase. It's a very big bank. One of the good features of that for our clients is that there is a specialized team to work with companies at each stage of their growth and development. So in terms of what we provide at the stage I work with, we know that companies are just beginning their journey of fundraising. They probably are going to raise several rounds of investor capital at least. We want to be a secure and reputable place for them to put their money and to be able to tell investors, oh, this is where you would wire money, and have that sound beyond reproach as a very good choice. We also want to provide things that don't rely on our founders' personal credit. So we know that that's often a pain point for founders, right? They don't want their own personal finances to be even more at risk, let's say, by getting a credit card taken out in their personal name, personal credit. And we also have a suite of startup offers that we offer, which are basically negotiated rates that JPMorgan has been able to put in place that we pass on to our clients using our buying power to their benefit. We have various vendors who a lot of startups use who we can offer discounts on. And then we also know that companies at this stage need a cap table. So happy to talk about that a little bit more and talk about we have 401k offerings for startups, things that might help them as they're scaling. But as you asked, companies are going to grow, and when they further capitalize and they grow as a company, they will eventually transition, hopefully if they're successful, from my startup banking part of the bank to another team within the innovation economy division of JPMorgan. And that group is also startup focused. So startup is actually a pretty broad term. You can be a very early stage startup, and then there are startups raising a series A, B, C, D. It goes on and on these days. And we have different teams within the bank that have products and services that match the needs of the venture at various stages. So maybe over time, as that venture is de-risked, brings in a series A, a series B, then they will have access to offerings such as venture debt or lines of credit, which I don't offer in my startup banking platform, but are appropriate for ventures at a later stage. And then as companies mature, they can really stay with JPMorgan forever. So if you are a company that's growing and you are achieving revenue, or you're considering an IPO, let's say you're negotiating an acquisition with a strategic or with a peer company, we have expertise here to help clients with all of those journeys, and we can meet their needs at each stage.
Yeah, it's really neat to see that you can have a seamless transition as you continue to grow your company. And I guess the question becomes, how do you look at the partnering with other groups within JPMorgan? Because I would imagine there's diversified experience and skill sets with the different bankers and the different divisions. And what are some of the other services other than the ones you've described to us that you provide in your sort of startup offers that JPMorgan or yourself personally might become involved in, Sara?
Yeah. So the group of bankers that work in the team I'm on, the startup banking team, have a pretty rich, varied set of backgrounds. So let me start by saying we're geographically distributed. So I'm located in DC and work out of our JPMorgan DC office. I covered the DC, Maryland, Virginia region. And then I have peers who are in different parts of the country, who are in New York, Boston, different parts of California, one in Texas. So that team includes some bankers like myself who have really come from experiences within operating companies. And there are others among us who've worked in tech transfer offices or as venture capital investors. So that team brings both bankers with decades of experience in banking and also some of us who have these varied, more hands-on or industry-embedded experiences. And this allows us to offer really industry-specific programming and support to our JPMorgan startup banking clients. I guess I'll describe that can take a couple different forms. So here in the DMV, I convene dinners and events for my clients as a way of connecting people, and making those ecosystem introductions that are so valuable. We also hold client receptions at major national conferences such as Bio International, which is coming up, and Vive and Health. So if you are a local client who works with me and is based, let's say, in the Rockville area or based in Gaithersburg, but you're going to Health in Las Vegas, we have ways to connect with you there, even though you know me as your banker and I am here in DC. And then in terms of thinking about how I bring my experience and my industry knowledge to support my clients, I'll share that I bring a lot of the same skills and behaviors that I was using in my NIH role, and I bring that to working with my banking clients. So I will provide, for example, one-on-one pitch coaching for my clients. If a client has slides that they're preparing to present to investors, or they have documents they're preparing for a conference, I will review those. I'll give feedback. I will do a pitch coaching session, or I will provide edits on their executive summary. I also like to be a resource for my clients. So I've had clients reach out to me and say, hey, we're hiring in the area. Do you know who is looking, or do you have any recommendations? I have clients who reach out to me about vendors. They'll ask, like, I need a fractional CFO, or I'm looking for the right law firm to help me as I really grow. And so all of those are pieces of regional industry knowledge that I am happy to share with clients. And then that helps me feel like it's not just one dimension that I'm supporting them, but really bringing all of my experience and knowledge to the banking relationship.
Well, Sara, it sounds like you bring a lot more than a traditional commercial banker does, because of your background and experience and your understanding of the needs of what the potential clients in the life science industry have. And we're speaking with Sara Dauber, who is the vice president with JPMorgan in the early stage life science and healthcare sector for startup banking. So let's talk a little bit more about this gap that JPMorgan's trying to fill for early stage companies. I know you can be all things to all people based on all the breadth of the divisions and services you offer, but how do you differentiate from the others who are working in this space trying to work with early stage life science companies, Sara?
So as many of us know and lived through, there was a banking crisis a few years ago. And I experienced this as an advisor to companies from within my NIH role and saw how roiled the market was and how upsetting this was for startups. And that we really learned in a very clear, concrete way that startups were really vulnerable when the bank that was serving them and holding their cash reserves did not have cash to cover withdrawals. And that led to a very painful time. JPMorgan, as a bank, has worked with startups for centuries. So there's actually this whole part of JPMorgan culture of the bank about how JPMorgan himself, the person, not just the bank, but the person, really believed in Thomas Edison and in his innovation, and that Morgan at his home in Manhattan was one of the first to recognize the potential of electric light and invested in Edison's early experiments. And he had his Fifth Avenue Manhattan mansion electrified in 1881, which apparently was quite early. I like that story as an example of the way that innovation is bred into the JPMorgan culture, because I think most people think of JPMorgan as a very staid, established, secure place and don't realize that part of the culture I've encountered since starting here is this adoption and acceptance and enthusiasm for innovation and for startups.
Sounds like he was an early stage venture capitalist.
I think that term may or may not be perfectly applied to him. Yes, he was an early and eager adopter and put his money and then his choices as a buyer also in that camp. So JPMorgan, which has always had this cultural focus and I think cultural alignment with startups, is not always been known so well as working with startups. But we have really been focused on getting the word out in the last couple of years that we do work with companies this early. And often one of the responses I get as I'm out in Baltimore or I'm out in, let's say, Rockville at an event or in DC, people say to me like, oh, I didn't know JPMorgan worked with companies as early as mine. And so we want to get the word out and make sure that founders do know that we are here in this space, that you don't have to sacrifice on the quality of your bank. You can be banking with a very high reputation institution, even as you are starting out as a company that has to prove itself. And you can start with us and you can stay with us for the entire life of your venture because you don't really outgrow JPMorgan. So we try to put the strength of the bank's fortress balance sheet to work so that the kind of crisis that experienced a few years ago doesn't have to be inevitable or doesn't have to be a concern of early stage clients. And we think that that's valuable also for these startup clients who are raising money because they can go to their investors and also their employees and show that the management are making really mature, responsible choices with a highly reputable partner, even when the venture itself is very high risk and very early stage. So that's part of how we differentiate is with our extremely strong fortress balance sheet and also with the bankers who I talked about how I have this background of having worked in startups, I think that differentiates us of having bankers who really understand the personal experience of working in a startup and what it's like and how many different jobs each person at the venture is trying to do at once. I bring really industry-specific knowledge that I can deploy and apply and use to be helpful to our clients.
Thank you. That gives me a good way of differentiating your services versus some other bankers that I have talked to. And by the way, earlier you mentioned Bio Conference, which is coming up in a couple of weeks. Are you going out to the Bio Conference in San Diego, Sarah, or will there be a JPMorgan presence there?
I am not going personally this time. I've attended it in Boston several times. It's a huge conference, always a lot of fun. I am not going out to San Diego. I know that you're having a bunch of different events there. I saw in the latest email and highlighting all the ways that people can connect there. JPMorgan Startup Banking will be out there. So if people are going, they should keep an eye out for my colleagues and say hello.
Okay, great. Have them stop by the Maryland and Virginia booths because we'll be promoting the BioHealth Capital Region, which is where a lot of your clients reside. So one of the other things you mentioned earlier in our discussion was a cap table tool. Can you talk a little bit about, first of all, what's a cap table for those listeners who don't understand what the cap table is? And second of all, what is the tool that JP Morgan's created to assist early stage companies in building their cap table?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So cap table is a shortened term that is used for the full length word of capitalization table. This is a document that a venture holds that tells you the official truth, like the official story about who owns the company and how the ownership is divided. So I've actually been responsible at several startups for manning the cap table or for building out this tool. So this is something I really appreciate from my firsthand experience in a few different startups over the last couple of decades. At the beginning of founding a company, a founder might wonder, do I need a cap table? I started this business and I own 100% of it, they might say. Or you might have two family members or two colleagues who start a company together and split the ownership 50-50. And it feels at that point very straightforward about what is the absolute truth of who owns this business. And it is straightforward at the beginning, hopefully, but there are challenges that arise because things don't always stay quite so simple. The cap table matters because sometimes founders who start out as part of the founding team drop out. They go pursue another career option, or one of them quits their day job and devotes their full-time energy, let's say, to the new company, but another one is waiting and they're staying in their day job until the angel investment comes in, let's just say. And so, you make adjustments over time to who owns what portion of the company. And then you may take money from friends and family or from some more formal investor group. And in exchange for that money, you give them a portion of ownership of the company. A lot of early stage companies hope to eventually get to a venture capital financing round and sell those investors, let's say, a share class that might be different than the share class that they gave away to their early scientific advisory board members. And so you want to make an effort to kind of keep all of this straight and keep a very clear record of who owns how much of the company and in what kind of share. Because in your next round of VC investment, let's say you get to another round, the existing owners are going to get diluted. And this just repeats over and over again, and it gets much more complex and it can get very confusing very quickly. A good lawyer is going to be quite helpful in making sense of all this, but you also need some kind of official repository for the ownership structure. And that is what we refer to as the cap table. The first startup I joined, which was in 2008, had a very simple cap table. And I managed that in Excel, and it was just a few line items. And I maintained that all the way through several tranches of a Series B round that we brought in. But in later companies that I joined, we moved on from using Excel and we used a more specialized software tool that helped us because it let us do scenario planning, and it also let us differentiate between share classes and employee stock options when those became a real thing. So there are a number of good tools out there to do this job, and JPMorgan offers one of them, which has the good feature of being free. So we call this tool Workplace Solutions. And it is a cloud-based software tool that founders can use to improve the professionalism and the investment readiness of their startup. No matter what stage you're in or what industry you serve, Workplace Solutions is a very easy to use and robust tool. It doesn't cost anything, and that's a nice way for a cash-strapped startup to make decisions sometimes about what tools to use. It is a robust web-based cap table tool, and it is free for all. And then if you're a client of ours, there's some additional functionality that you get as a JPMorgan startup banking client.
Thank you for that explanation. You cleared it up a little bit for me at the end. You said, basically, it's free for all. So if you're not a JPMorgan Chase client, you can have access to Workplace Solutions. But once you become a client, you actually turn on a few extra features that will help benefit them in this management. Is that correct?
Yeah, the difference is technically in the number of stakeholders in the cap table tool. So when you're starting out with a co-founder, you might just have 2 stakeholders, 2 line items in your cap table. And the free version is available for up to about 40 stakeholder line items. And if you come and bank with us at Startup Banking at JPMorgan, you get 100 stakeholder line items for free.
Correct. Thank you. And then we talked earlier, but I got a chance to meet you when you were working at the National Institute of Health at NINDS, which supported science ventures with some early stage SBIR, Small Business Innovation Research grant funding. And basically, you might explain what NINDS was for the listeners who don't know all of the different 27 institutes of NIH. And second of all, how did that experience help you shape the way you work with startups today at JPMorgan?
Yes. So NINDS was an acronym that I did not know either before I went to work there. I came to DC, as I had said, for my husband's career, and I worked for a startup remotely for about a year into that time here in the DMV. And my work at NINDS, which is the National Institute for Neurological Disorders and Stroke, grew out of networking that I did, meeting people. And I met the team that runs the small business program there at NINDS. And NINDS serves all of the neurological disorders, stroke, and related scientific areas. And that was kind of a coincidence. It wasn't necessarily that I had knowledge in that space scientifically, but when I connected with the professionals there, they were looking for a business person who understood life sciences to support and come in and fill a role on their small business program team. So the role was created for me. So that was nice in that it kind of matched what I knew how to do and what I was bringing. So I had worked in operating companies in roles that involved managing cross-functional program teams and a lot of roles that had involved setting up process and systems in early stage startups. And I was able to bring that experience to NINDS in a role where I functioned as a business advisor to companies who received grants from the small business program at NINDS. And while I was there for 5 years, I saw a lot more of what small businesses struggle with. I interacted with dozens and dozens of management teams. I learned a lot while I was there about pitch deck coaching. That was not something I had done in my earlier years, but I did a lot of that at NIH and something I continue to enjoy doing for my JPMorgan clients, actually. And I also learned about how companies function with SBIR grants and what the resources are that are out there for them and the pros and cons of small business funding from the government. It was really a good role that kind of took me from where I had been, from the operating experience I had amassed in a range of startups I'd worked for, and broadened that experience by letting me interact with a lot of different management teams. But the pivot after that was quite a big one. So I don't want to understate how big a deal it was with the Doge cuts at a moment in midlife. I am in my late 40s, trying to figure out how I take what I already know and apply it in new ways. And so the transition into JPMorgan has allowed me to take those skills that I amassed and then apply them in this new direction with banking clients.
I think that's valuable experience you had at NINDS and the SBIR program, which for some listeners who have never applied for it is really the world's largest early stage seed funding program for life science companies. It's almost $1.5 billion at the National Institute of Health through the 27 different institutes there. The nice thing about that program is it's generally a grant, which it's competitive. It's very competitive for people to win, but they don't have to pay it back, which is really nice. And the other thing is it establishes credibility and validation for the early stage company because there's been an independent third party make a decision to invest in an early stage company, which also probably, and you can speak to this from your experience, makes it easier for you to potentially look at getting engaged with one of these companies that may have been funding by NIH versus those who have never received any independent third-party funding at all at the stage when you encounter them.
Yeah, I think often in the small startup space, having a grant from a federal agency is an example of the kind of traction that shows that outsiders validate what you're doing, validate the approach you're taking, and validate your science.
And then during your time at NIH, you worked with some of our entrepreneurs in residence, as we call it, the biohealth innovation entrepreneurs in residence, which have been supporting SBIR-funded companies at NIH for now probably about 12 years. What stood out to you about that type of experience? Because you actually ended up doing some of the same things that EIRs did post-NIH, and you're doing some of that today. And then also you did a little bit of work with Solaxa with Luis Gutierrez and Jen Butler. Talk a little bit about that experience you had with them.
Yeah, I've had a really positive, lovely experience getting to know the BHI EIRs. That was one of the highlights of my time at NIH, actually, because I didn't have any peers of any sort in my role at NINDS. That meant that I had a lot of variety in the work I did. I was the only small business strategic consultant, is what I was called in that role. But it also meant that sometimes I didn't have anyone else to learn from in that role, right? To look at to and say, oh, how do you support a company with this challenge? But what I could do is look to the EIRs for that. And I was definitely the beneficiary of opportunities to collaborate. Many times I would be providing support alongside some of those EIRs. So I worked closely with Ethel and with Louis. There would be times that we were pitch coaching companies who were going to a conference, who were being sent by NIH at NIH's expense to go to a conference. And so we would meet with them and help them prepare for that event and for the investors, let's say, and the strategics that they were going to meet at the conference. And I really loved listening to the advice that they got from these BHI EIRs. I learned a lot from them. It was also a helpful way for me to understand the kind of help that these companies need, because it's a different role when you've been in the company and then when you become an advisor. And how do you find that boundary of what you advise them and how you give them helpful guidance without being the one who does the work? It's a different role you play. And then I also, as you said, had a side gig for a time where I was working with a local company called Solaxa. And that was when I met Jen. I had not met her previously, and I got to know Louis even better. I had interacted with him in our NIH work. And I really saw, what a meaningful impact that they were having on each venture that they touched, and whether it was really embedded in the company, as was the case at Solaxa, it was like a much more intimate engagement that I witnessed, or the work that the BHI staff was doing at NIH, where it was more arm's length, as I described, where it was advising in very finite ways. Those were excellent teachers for me and excellent colleagues in a way for me, who I really enjoyed.
It's been a great partnership, and we're the beneficiary that you didn't have to leave the biohealth capital region. You got to stay, even though you changed booths, as they say, at the convention to go from an NIH booth to a JPMorgan booth. You basically are able to stay with a lot of people you knew and cultivated relationships with while you were at NIH here in the biohealth capital region. So we are glad that you have been able to maintain those relationships. And Sara, this has been a great intro. And you know that this isn't just about what services JPMorgan offers. It's also about people who are going through different stages of their own personal careers and have to make decisions, whether they've been doged or not, about where do I go next? And you're an excellent example of someone who's made a transition from one area in a very specific life science focused area with NIH to the commercial side with JPMorgan. So congratulations on making a successful transition that you've made. And for the listeners that have listened to this very interesting podcast with you, is there anything that we didn't discuss that you want to leave for the listeners? And more importantly, how do they get in touch with you if they have an interest in learning more about JPMorgan's commercial banking services with you?
Yeah. Thank you for the conversation and for the questions and the opportunity. On that theme that you picked up here just at the end about transitions and being able to stay in one place, stay in a region and continue to work in new ways, I'm really grateful for the opportunity to do something new. The Doge cuts really threw me for a loop. It's really hard when you have to try to figure out something new to do. And I was anchored here in the DC area. I knew I wasn't going anywhere. I have teenagers in high school. I have a husband with a career here. And it is reassuring to realize that in middle age, you can figure out something new. You can reinvent yourself a little bit while also making use of the relationships and the knowledge that has come from decades of working. And I hope that is reassuring to the many other people who go through transitions or by their own choice or because of some external factors have to reinvent themselves and figure out a new role for themselves. And I'm really grateful to be able to do that. And as you said, to rely on these relationships that already existed and not have to totally start from scratch. I also just want to mention that as I was choosing this job, one of the things that also seemed appealing to me was trying to figure out something that was a little bit AI resistant or like safe. And I think as someone who is further into my career, I'm more toward the end of my career. I'm probably really in the middle, but I don't feel like I'm at the beginning of my career. And I wanted something that was going to feel like it was giving me new skills, but also not something that AI was going to eliminate in the near future. And so being in a role that's really about relationships and really about getting to know people and getting to know what their company needs in order to thrive is an area that was really appealing to me. So I'm building new skills for sure, and I'm augmenting my existing skills. And one of the things I've learned working in startups is that no jobs are really safe or secure. You know, you would have maybe thought the government was more safe and secure, but I've proven that wasn't true either. And so to me, building skills and building relationships is really how I think about choosing new roles and creating security for myself in my career. And it's exciting to have an opportunity to do that in a new way. So I would just share that with the listeners. And then thank you for your prompt about how to get in touch with me. My email address is sara.dauber@jpmorgan.com. And you can find me that way, or you can find me on LinkedIn. And I'm happy to talk to innovators and entrepreneurs and others who want to learn about JPMorgan startup banking or just want to connect.
And then also for the listeners, can you spell Sara Dauber? Because that's something that is not traditionally spelled in the way that people would anticipate it to be.
Yeah, it's not obvious. Okay, so Sara.Dauber is SARA.DAUBER@jpmorgan.com.
Thank you very much, Sara. And Sara is the vice president with JPMorgan Early Stage Life Sciences and Healthcare and Startup Banking. And we thank Sara for being on BioTalk today. And we're going to come back a year from now and see what other skills you've developed and how you've helped cultivate and grow the biohealth capital region, Sara.
Thanks, Rich.
Thanks for listening to BioTalk with Rich Bendis.